Hello, everyone. We are at the last panel of the day, which is also the very last panel of our conference. Thanks to everybody for joining us for this last panel. So during this one, we will be hearing from two graduate students on the theme of Histories of Racialization. Unfortunately, again, our last presenter here had to drop out at the last minute because of family reasons. These are COVID times. So as with the other panels, if anyone has questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A box. Our first presenter is Mohsin Ali, who is a doctoral candidate in the Islamic Studies program at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Mohsin will be presenting his paper entitled Narrating Muslim Histories in 19th-Century North India. Take it away.
Thank you. First, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this event, the audience for attending, and the professors taking the time to provide responses. My presentation is titled Muslim Historical Thought in 19th Century North India. New ways of analyzing the past developed among Muslims in North India in the 19th century that departed from dominant Indo-Persian modes of historical writing. Unpacking these historical changes requires attending to multiple intellectual traditions. In that vein, this presentation makes two arguments. First, that a new European influenced historicist mode of historical writing emerged among modernist intellectuals. Writing in the vernacular Urdu, they felt a sense of rupture from the past, even as they increasingly saw the need to produce histories that could help define Indian Muslims as a distinct community and inheritors of a once great Islamic quote-unquote civilization that was now in decline. However, many classically trained scholars or ulama eschewed the discourse of civilizational decline. Thus, the second argument of the paper is that there were important changes related to historical thinking that had their antecedents not in colonial historiography, but in intellectual changes in religious scholarship from the previous century. Thus, many scholars who were confident in their intellectual heritage were nonetheless critical of what they deemed a general lack of historical knowledge amongst Indian scholars towards their intellectual heritage. These ulama adopted for what I'm terming an Arabo-intellectual mode of historical writing, where they sought out early Arabic sources for historical information to track the flow and development of knowledge or ilm through generations. Thus, rather than writing civilizational narratives to define Islamic civilization or a Muslim community, this historical interests of these scholars served a much narrower academic purpose of adjusting religious learning through revitalizing interest in the intellectual history of the early centuries of Islam. I will begin first by discussing the writings of modernist intellectuals writing in Urdu and adopting a more historicist mode. Historical education became a central facet of colonial educational endeavors in British India. European perspectives filtered into Muslim discourse, initially through Urdu translations of European histories, especially the ones utilized and translated at the Delhi College, a hybrid institution established in 1828, combining a traditional Arabic and Persian curriculum with a Western humanistic curriculum taught in English and Urdu, located towards the southwest of the old city of Delhi, which I've circled in red. The students at this institution learned that history was a science concerned with understanding the progress and decline of civilizations and nations through the use of problematic sources that had to be read with great skepticism. Margaret Purnell has argued that this use of civilization represented a new development in the British notion of civility, where, quote, it no longer exclusively or even primarily described a well-defined state that had to be reached, i.e. civility, but an open and never-ending process, i.e. civilizing or civilization, end quote. Moreover, this new notion of civilization as process also had within it the assumption of temporal progress, as nations moved as nations moved towards civilization or declined and moved backwards. Colonial instruction focused on the history of Western civilization in particular, which was uh, rooted in ancient Greece, advanced with the Roman Empire, declined during the medieval Dark Ages, and then progressed again after the Renaissance. These ideas were popularized in the latter half of the 19th century in a new Urdu public sphere through translations commissioned by Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan Scientific Society and through his widely circulated journal, the Tahzib al-Akhlaq. In this next section, I'm going to briefly overview some of the writings of modernist Muslim intellectuals associated with Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan and the movement to provide Muslims with an English education. The first author I'll look at is Altaf Hussein al-Hali. The themes of the birth, rise, and then decline of an Islamic civilization were amplified in dramatic fashion in Hali's Maddo Jazr Islam, The Ebb and Flow of Islam, a versified narrative published serially, first in the Tahzib al-Akhlaq in 1879, and then later published as a book and became an immediate sensation in India. The Greek origins of modern European nations, followed by the rise and dominance of the Roman Empire, paralleled the Arab origins of the Indian Muslim community, also the establishment of an Islamic civilization, starting with the Prophet Muhammad, followed by a civilizational golden age during the Abbasid period. And just as the fall of the Roman Empire had caused the European Dark Ages, the post-Abbasid period, according to Hali, represented Islam's dark age, which Muslims had yet to recover from. While responding to accusations that Islam itself was responsible for Muslim decline and violence, Muslim modernists like Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan adopted an Orientalist skepticism towards the veracity and authenticity of early Arabic sources about Islamic history, including about the life of the Prophet. In fact, Sir Sayyid considered modernity, which he used the term hal ka zamana, to be an age of skepticism, and thus everything was doubted until evidence could be presented. Much of what was recorded and related in books of Muslim histories thus was simply no longer believable. He wrote, quote, "It is impossible to reach the time of the Prophet and companions," end quote, because of the lack of credible sources. This leads to a paradox that Sir Said realized. The study of history was necessary to learn the causes of Muslim decline and how Islam is capable of progress, and to inspire Muslims to work towards progress. But, quote, "the problem lies in figuring out whether the information that has reached us is true. The feats of our ancestors are scattered and mixed with falsehoods," end quote. In his Musaddas, Hali had contrasted the historical knowledge of contemporary Muslims with advancements in historical studies Muslims had once achieved in their past, and that the Europeans had now inherited from Muslims. Mohsin al-Mulk, another important Muslim intellectual and modernist, echoed similar sentiments in two reviews in the 1870s of Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddama, published in the Tahzib al-Akhlaq. Because Mohsin al-Mulk was reading the published version of Muqaddama from France, Mohsin al-Mulk states that without Europe, Muslims would be unaware of even their own historical traditions. And he warns Muslims of the imperative to carry out their own historical research because of its use in religious polemics. Furthermore, Ibn Khaldun's work is a reminder for Mohsin al-Mulk that despite having developed principles of source criticism, Muslim historians failed to apply it, and thus much of what they wrote was nothing more than stories and legends. Due to such carelessness, according to Mohsin al-Mulk, Islam had become disgraced and its enemies had fodder for their polemics. His reading of Ibn Khaldun is also filtered through contemporary notions of natural and social laws and racial distinctions. Thus, he states that according to Ibn Khaldun, a historian must keep in mind laws related to nature and society, using the English terms. And Mohsin al-Mulk also sees in the work lessons about the rise and decline of entire nations, not just dynasties and empires. And he also introduces European racial thinking in his views, as he quotes from anonymous European sources in connection to Ibn Khaldun's discussion about the effects of climates on humans, and asserts that, for example, Greeks are naturally more rational and Hindus naturally more irrational and emotional because of the effects over centuries of their environments. Similarly, this type of discourse was utilized by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan and other of his associates to define a distinctly North Indian Muslim community that was part of the Islamic civilization, but also racially distinct. Unlike modernist writers, many ulama in the 19th century did not articulate narratives of civilizational decline. Scholars writing in the Arabo-intellectual mode were more interested in early Islamic history, the histories of the religious sciences, such as hadith and fiqh, and more carefully rooting historical information in older, reliable sources, especially early Arabic sources. They assumed that knowledge was embodied in people, not texts, and thus learning the various religious disciplines required not just studying texts, but also required familiarity with the authors of those texts, as well as the teachers who had transmitted that knowledge down to the present. Consequently, these historians placed the present within the cumulative history of religious intellectual traditions. This mode of historical writing had been relatively marginal before the 19th century in North India. Quoting the historian Sumit Guha, it was Islamicate Persian traditions more open to the adoption of legend and hearsay rather than the austere and rigorous tradition of Arabic scriptural inquiry, end quote, that had been dominant. Due to the limitations of time, I will briefly sample the works of two scholars. The first is Abdul Hayy al-Lakhnawi, who was from the famed Frangi Mehli family located in Lucknow. He made prolific use of lithographic printing to publish works he had critically edited from a number of manuscripts on some of the earliest sources of the Hanafi tradition, such as Muhammad al-Shaybani's Jami' Saghir and his recension of the Muwatta. Similar to works of hadith, these early Islamic classics were extremely scarce and rare in India. And al-Lakhnawi writes how it had become common in India to suffice with later books of fiqh and their commentaries. The publication of early Hanafi classics was part of Lakhnawi's larger critique of what he deemed historical ignorance of the changes and developments that Islamic intellectual traditions, particularly hadith and fiqh, had undergone. Al-Lakhnawi believed this historical ignorance had was partially the cause of the problem of partisan bigotry, ta'assub, among Indian scholars, echoing arguments Shah Waliullah had made a century earlier. Al-Lakhnawi also compiled a biographical dictionary of Hanafi scholars because he stated that biographical information about Hanafi scholars were difficult or even impossible to find in India. Quote, I have found the scholars in our land from our time and many who came before treating history as if it were strange and have turned their backs to it, and thus it has become a forgotten and lost treasure. He also states that he divided up the history of Hanafi scholars into introductions that he added to the books of fiqh he published to make the history more accessible and easier to read. Moreover, he specifically writes that he chose not to write about Sufis because he believed books on their lives were replete and found all over India. In the course of historicizing the Hanafi tradition, al-Lakhnawi at times criticized information in the books of Nawab Sadiq Hasan Khan, an influential anti-Taqlid scholar, and also the Nawab consort to the Begum Shah Jahan, the third in line of queens who had ruled the princely state of Bhopal. Al-Lakhnawi accused Sadiq Hasan Khan of historical taqlid, that is, relying on later sources for biographical and historical information, particularly relying heavily on Ibn Khaldun, instead of verifying information by going back to earlier sources. This provoked a number of published responses and then counter responses between 1883 and 1884 about verifying historical information, reading printed works, and these debates were not limited to India, but also spread to the Middle East. Despite his political position as Nawab consort, Sadiq Hasan Khan's historical interest was primarily in Islamic intellectual history, as seen in one of his best-known works, the 3-volume encyclopedic work Abjad al-Ulum, published in Bhopal in 1878. He states that he based it primarily on a number of Ottoman sources, but also on the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. The book is about the different ways scholars have categorized and conceptualized knowledge, followed by information on books and authors based on the disciplines in which they wrote about. The third part of this encyclopedic work is a biographical encyclopedia the last part of the book is a biographical encyclopedia of authors that have made important contributions to the various disciplines. In the biographical sections, and also in a separate work devoted to the history of hadith, his Al-Hitta fi Dhikr Sahih Sitta, Sadiq Hassan Khan elaborates his vision of a brighter revival of religious learning that had taken place in the preceding centuries, especially a revival of hadith learning in the Hijaz, Yemen, and India. He quotes from Kashf al-Dhanun that non-Arab ulama have been preeminent that this Ajam ulama have been preeminent in the intellectual history of Islam compared to Arab scholars. However, he's also critical at times in his biographical notices, especially regarding what he viewed was a pernicious problem amongst Indian scholars, that is the problem of ta'assub, or religious bigotry. He believed that the root cause of ta'assub was the lack of familiarity with the early history of Islam. However, that this ignorance had been especially pronounced in India because the study of hadith had been neglected until Shah Waliullah, according to Sadiq Hassan Khan. Ottomans had been reading Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah since the 16th century while reflecting on imperial decline, and had been completely translated into Turkish by 1858. Sadiq Hassan Khan's similar interest in Ibn Khaldun and his awareness of geographies and histories of Islam is apparent in his Luqta al-Ajalan mimma tamassa ila ma'rifatihi hajat al-insan, which was published in Istanbul in 1879. Sadiq Hassan Khan discusses how different communities or ummas measure historical time based on different calendars, based on memorable events, and differing myths. The different communities could be religious, such as Jewish communities, Christians, Zoroastrian, Hindus, as well as geographic, such as Europe and China. He cautions readers from accepting the myths of other ummas about ancient history because it's a great temporal gap that produce legends that are not verifiable. And he also provides long excerpts from Ibn Khaldun to critique the practice of taqlid in history, the very thing which Abdul Hayy Lakhnawi accused him of doing. He also draws on Ibn Khaldun to reflect on the fall of the Mughals. According to Ibn Khaldun, there are periods of momentous change and periods where not much change occurs. For example, 14th century North Africa was momentous since organized habitation, or Imran, had been devastated by a combination of Arab invasions and a plague. The Mughal Empire in the 18th and 19th century had experienced devastation on a similar scale, according to Nawab Sadiq Hassan Khan, due to British colonialism. It is important to note that Sadiq Hassan Khan, just as Ibn Khaldun and the Ottoman intellectuals reading the Muqaddimah, thought about cyclical rise and decline in terms of dynasties and polities rather than in terms of civilizational rise and decline. Moreover, just as Ibn Khaldun viewed moments of historical change as especially worthy of being recorded in history, so too does Nawab Sadiq Hassan Khan. Yet, like Abdul Hayy, Nawab Sadiq Hassan Khan chose to focus on intellectual history. Writing the history of modern Muslim historiographies thus requires being attentive to intellectual influences beyond Europe. And this perspective also avoids interpreting the 19th century teleologically as a moment of proto-nationalism, leading to the religious nationalisms of the 20th century. I'll end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohsin. Our second speaker is Mahdi Blaine, who is a master's student at the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies at New York University. Mahdi will be presenting on a paper entitled Becoming a Moor. Take it away.
First of all, I would like to thank both Kylie and Arpen for all their hard work in putting this together, and also thank in advance Dr. Carter for taking the time to read my piece and provide insight and commentary. And lastly, of course, thank the Duke-UNC Consortium for giving me the opportunity to share my work and research. So on July 15th, 2019, a rather strange ceremony took place on the steps of Philadelphia City Hall. A few days prior, as part of a broader diversity initiative, Mayor Jim Keeney proclaimed the day to be Morocco Day, a time to commemorate Moroccan Americans' contributions to the city. It was apparent, though, that his administration did not do their research, as the delegation who joined them at the ceremony were not Moroccan Americans, but rather members of the Moorish Science Temple of America, the MSTA. And I'm going to refer to them as the MSTA throughout. Donned in fezzes and robes, the delegation aided in raising up the Moroccan flag as a means to honor not only the achievements of Moroccans in the city, but also to symbolize the close ties the city had with the kingdom. As Mayor Keeney went on to say, the city of Philadelphia is proud to be the home of choice for many people of this descent of the nation of Morocco. And as you can see here, this was a picture of the event, and you can see the representative Sheila Hess with the Philadelphia chapter. So founded in Chicago in 1926 by Noble Jew Ali, the Moorish Science Temple of America was a religious organization whose membership claimed to be the descendants of the Moors of Northwest Africa. They identified their faith as Islam, and they officially licensed while officially licensed as a religious organization, the congregation sought to forge a new Black American political community. By the late 1920s, the group amassed some 35,000 followers, with chapters in several important American cities, with Chicago acting as the headquarters. For 3 decades, the group would be the primary apparatus of Black Muslim life in the United States. But the group began to fracture with the founding of the Nation of Islam. But as evident from these Morocco Day festivities, the organization managed to stay alive in a few key cities. So popularly described as one of the progenitors of Black nationalist movements, the MSTA is largely understood to be one of the earlier expressions of Black nationalism, separatism, and sovereignty. In my paper, though, I sought to problematize that notion by contextualizing the MSTA within American Orientalist discourses and Black American discourses on citizenship and political inclusion. In what I describe as an articulation of Black Orientalism, I argue that the figure of the Moor came to embody the principles of the idealized universal subject, rather than merely an origin story for the MSTA's members. For MSTA adherents, faith alone was not sufficient in reclaiming Moorishness. Rather, Moorish identity came to be embodied by adherence to a practice of civic engagement and inclusion into American political and economic modernity. And secondly, I'll argue that the Moorish science of Jew Ali relied upon modes of racial thought that fell outside the purview of the American racial order. For Ali, Moorishness, the intertwining of Islam and the non-white body, lay within the essence of all Black Americans. Thus, even conversion to Christianity did not change this fixed essence, rather serving to bind Black Americans within the American racial order. By drawing upon Cedric Robinson's concept of racial regimes, I tie Ali's ideology to the earlier conceptions of blood purity during the latter years of the Spanish Inquisition. By highlighting their similarities, I demonstrate the flexibility and uneven endurance of racial thought. In sum, what was used to consolidate a political community that excluded Iberian Muslims and Jews was now in the 1920s used to subvert notions of Black inferiority and provide a language for Black American political inclusion. So I'm going to set the stage by starting in Europe. And as you can see, these are several sort of depictions of the Moors made by European artists. And you'll see at different moments in history, they'll look like wildly different. And it sort of showcases the very protean and ambivalent nature of this figure within the European imaginary. So since the Muslim invasions of Spain in 711 CE, the figure of the Moor remained an ambivalent figure within the Western imagination. But for the purposes of my argument, I focus on a specific reformulation of racial thought during the Spanish Inquisition. Towards the latter half of the Inquisition, there arose an anxiety over the multitude of Iberian Jews and Muslims who decided to convert to Christianity. In this newly forming Christian nation, the idea of millions of converts who did not necessarily look physically different from Christian-born Iberians led to several questions about the nature of Christian identity. Understandings of conversion as a means to escape heathenness thus contradicted with the project of forging a nation of indigenous, pure Iberian Christians. Consequently, this catalyzed the development of biological notions of race in which an unseen distinction was needed. As Ania Lumba says, hence the need to find a distinction that lay deeper inside, or a purity of blood, in which in this case corresponded exactly to a supposed purity of faith. In 1480, the Inquisition had formalized the correspondence between the two by proclaiming that religious faith was manifested in purity of blood. Thus, differences in faith indicated different interior essences, and faith was not a matter of individual choice. By making an unseen inner quality, such as faith, fixed, the Inquisition effectively changed the negative values and moral character to the otherwise physically similar phenotype of Iberian Muslims and Jews. In this formulation, Muslimness and Jewishness are understood as inherited qualities that serve to rationalize a social order predicated on mass expulsion of populations deemed to be not indigenous and outside the moral character of the budding Spanish Christian nation. So now, going several years into the future, transitioning to the US, I'll first start by highlighting a rather long history that situated the free Moroccan subject as worthy of white respect and acknowledgement. One of the earliest instances was the Moor Sundry Act of 1790, wherein 4 formerly enslaved Africans petitioned the South Carolina House of Representatives to reconsider their legal status. The 4 men, now known as the Free Moors, claimed that they were originally subjects of the Moroccan Empire who got captured in combat and sold into slavery in the Americas. They were able to buy their freedom, and with this petition, they wanted to be considered as citizens of the Moroccan Sultan. This namely meant that if they were to commit a crime, they would be tried as free citizens in a fair trial, rather than under the harsh provisions of the Negro Act of 1740. Despite the rather dubious nature of the men's story, the South Carolina House would actually pass this resolution that the free citizens of Moroccan descent were not subject to the laws governing free men and slaves. And sort of just to note, this is actually an interesting sort of comparison, because you have a treaty that is actually signed earlier in American history that is it's the Moroccan Sultanate was becoming the first country to actually recognize American sovereignty and independence. And in that treaty, it actually stipulates that Americans either captured by Moroccan privateers or captured just within the realms of the Moroccan Sultanate, they would not be subject to Moroccan laws. But more contemporary to the MSTA was an anecdote from Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, wherein he recounts how a supposedly dark-skinned man caused great agitation in an unnamed community in the South when he was able to secure a hotel reservation. When questioned by what Washington describes as a near lynch mob, the man clarified that he was indeed Moroccan, which immediately quelled their anger. The story came to convey how this man's Moroccan identity fell out of American constructions of Blackness. Moreover, Washington conveys how despite this man's physical features not changing, his foreignness allowed him to be conceived as outside of the bounds of the essentialized moral qualities of American Blackness. And in this context, the founding of the MSTA saw cultural difference emerge as a means to integrate Southern Black migrants in northern urban cities into a new alternative political community. The movement sought to divorce Black identity from Black Southern culture and the ostensible lawlessness, laziness, and immorality typically associated with it by white Americans, by forging a new identity altogether, the Moorish American. This allowed for members to now articulate Black modernity in its own terms, rather than through renderings of so-called post-Enlightenment Victorian ideals. Thus, through becoming a Moor, Black Americans got reconnected to a lost cultural patrimony, wherein laid the keys to their condition of possibility as modern American citizens. And this is a picture of the congregation. And if you see right in the middle, the gentleman standing in the white, that is the founder, Noble Jew Ali. So in MSTA founder Noble Juali's formulation, Black Americans were descended from the Moors of the ancient Moroccan Empire, a territory imagined as spanning most of Northwest Africa. Their holy book, the Holy Quran of the Moorish Science Temple of America, also known as the Seven Circles Quran, described Islam as the one true religion of the Asiatic or Canaanite race, thus establishing primordial ties to the Middle East. As he proclaimed, "This is the uniting of the Holy Quran of Mecca for teaching and instructing all Moorish Americans. The key of civilization was and is in the hands of the Asiatic nations." The Moorish, who were the ancient Moabites and the founders of the holy city of Mecca. And as you can see, members were also issued nationality identification cards, as well as being taught how to reanimate their once long lost history. In public spaces, they donned long flowing robes and fezzes as a means to accentuate their membership within a royal lineage. Ali taught his adherents that Black Americans were a chosen people who must maintain spiritual autonomy from white Americans, for Christianity was used to justify racism, discrimination, and slavery. Moreover, Ali stressed that it was only through the embrace of their Moorish roots that African Americans could take their place as equal citizens among the country's many ethnic groups. Most importantly, though, Ali taught that the goal of this movement was to uplift fallen humanity and teach those things necessary to make men and women become better citizens. To help achieve this goal, Ali published a newspaper titled The Moorish Guide, which became the primary means by which members received the MSTA's message. The content of the newspaper was varied, ranging from local news and political developments in Chicago to official announcements and teachings from Ali himself. This was the primary means by which Moorish Americans outside of Chicago were informed on how to practice their new tradition, and Ali used the publication to canonize the core tenets of the movement. In sum, the messages encouraged civic engagement, active participation in one's community, support of Black-owned businesses, and stressed the importance of law and order. Through print media, the MSTA not only indoctrinated followers in the divinity of Noble Juali, but also gave them the means to integrate and be incorporated into modern Black urban life. The exploits of the MSTA would eventually catch the eye of the Chicago Defender, the largest Black publication in the country at the time, which featured an article detailing Noble Juali's visit to the Chicago Postmaster. And in it, it said, "President Ali teaches fundamental principles which are desired for civilization, such as obedience to law, respect and loyalty to government, and tolerance and unity." And as you can see, this is one example of a newspaper, The Moorish Guide. And it's pretty obvious that they're actually very invested in local politics. As you can see, this is a headline talking about Lewis B. Anderson, who was a local politician in Chicago. And this is sort of a way, again, to sort of accentuate civic engagement. And it was sort of through the practice of these things that you, become a Moor and accentuate your Moorish identity. It was not really just through the faith and belief of Islam, and everything that was said in Ali's Quran. In creating Moorish American identity, the MSTA took into care of them. Ali understood the Moor to be a racial category that intertwined the non-white body with Islam. In creating the Moor, Ali essentially transplanted the models of ideal modern Black American citizenship onto the cultural and aesthetic values of the Moor. Therefore, being a Moor and practicing Ali's Islam was reasserting Black inclusion into American modernity, but in new terms. Okay. And as you can see here in this picture to the right, Ali's in the middle on this throne, and he's also with Congressman and the Chicago Alderman Robinson from the newspaper before. And as you can also see here, this is a photo with a chapter, and I mean, what are they in front of? An American flag. And so this was compelling since previous discourses on Black inclusion were articulated through the lens of Christian morality. Ali's turn to Islam, though, exposed a key contradiction underpinning Black Christian uplift narratives, that Black American inclusion into American citizenship is predicated on the profound violence experienced through slavery. Therefore, several Black discourses on racial uplift were unable to negotiate the modern Black American subject outside of a rationalization of white violence and imposition. Through the forging of a new Moorish cultural identity, the MSTA was able to position the values that Black Americans supposedly learned through the institution of slavery as something that was in fact lost by that very white violence and savagery. For Ali, learning to embrace Moorishness was not simply to dedicate oneself to the cultural aesthetics understood by Black Americans to be Moorish. Rather, one had to express their Moorish cultural identity by being engaged with their community and help propagate and uplift its members. Ali asserted that within every Black American laid a divine essence, which when tapped into through the remembrance of a Moorish past, can prop up the Black subject to a noble status. And this is just more examples. This is ads and in the Moorish Guide, but also in local newspapers that were promoting different Moorish Black-owned businesses. So as you can see these sort of oils, healing sort of treatments. And it was interesting because this was sort of a balancing act that had to be sort of done by adherents to the MSTA, because there were already sort of associations with, confidence men of the Muslim East who would come to, places like Chicago, New York, with these sort of secret remedies and get rich quick schemes. And with the MSTA, they had to sort of toe the line between the respectable and the exotic. So while this so-called divine essence served to place Moorish Americans outside the American racial order, it did not necessarily throw away ideologies centered around race essentialism. As I described earlier, the newly Iberian Christian polity forming at the tail end of the Reconquista engendered a social order that tied religious belief to blood, or an unseen essence. This differed from previous racial thinking in medieval Europe, which in many instances viewed religious conversion as an avenue out of, for figures like the Moor, heathen status. Thus, this iteration of blood test racial thinking was not related to the genealogical context of Muslim or Jewish Iberians, but rather posited that Muslimness and Jewishness actually resides in one's blood. But I guess, the big question here is how does this kind of thinking find an endurance in the American context? Well, in drawing from Robinson in his book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, Robinson critiques his contemporaries for overlooking the often chaotic and fungible nature of historical research. As he put it, this kind of scholarship privileges a Unitarianism where all the relations of power collaborate in and cohabit a particular discursive or disciplinary regime. He lamented how the American Academy in particular did not allow for what he viewed as the intentional and unintended. In other words, he stressed the consideration on the often fractured and uncanny means through which relations of power and cultural formations coalesce and collide in racial regimes. In regards to the MSTA, the fragmented endurance of Spanish blood purity came to fruition in their project of intertwining Islam with the non-white body as a means to unlock a lost noble essence. While the chance of Christian conversion was among the several justifications of chattel slavery in the Americas, emancipation necessitated new rationalizations of American social hierarchy. For what Ali may have realized was that uplift through the lens of Christian morality was not sufficient in making claims for political inclusion. As the white press made it clear, Christianity did not negate Blackness and all the negative associations essential to its being. Thus, in forging this community, Ali formulated that Islam is not only the original religion of Black Americans, but that it lied within them, waiting to be reawakened. Black Americans, in recognizing their foreign Moorish heritage, fall out of the fixity of American Blackness. Their Moorishness is thus tied to their Islamic faith, which is imbued with unseen, fixed, morally righteous qualities. Through understanding the endurance of discursive renderings of the Moor, it becomes clear that the claims of the MSTA share a similar ideological foundation as Inquisition Spain's formulations of blood purity. This is not simply to say that the presence of a sort of linear teleological legacy, though. Rather, I wanted to showcase the fungibility of racial thought, stressing the ways in which different relations of power can transition, collide, and in the words of Robinson, open the opportunity to generate resistance. And in the case of the MSTA, the same ideology that was used to legitimize the dispossession and expulsion of Iberian Muslims and Jews was used to fix Black Americans' inherently morally good moral character as a grounds for political inclusion into American civil society. And that is it for me.
Thank you so much. We will now move to the discussant's comments on your papers. The discussant for this panel is Dr. Youssef Carter, who is Assistant Professor and Keenan Rafai Fellow in Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. Carter, please go ahead and say all of your comments at once, and then the panelists will respond. Mahdi and Mohsin, please turn your cameras on for this period.
Yes, thank you so much. So I want to begin with a preliminary word of congratulations to the Duke-UNC Islamic Studies graduate students conference organizers for having put together a wonderful event. Second, bravo to these panelists for having written insightful papers. And so what each of these scholars have shared with us are how race and coloniality play a part in the formation of Muslim selfhood, albeit in either Indian or Black American Muslim contexts. And so I thoroughly enjoyed reading them, as I was impressed with their argumentative clarity as well as their respective analyses. Mohsin Ali discussed the sort of impact of Euro-Western thought on Indian Muslim intellectuality in order to reflect, as I gather, on legacies of colonization in relation to historical writing. And in our second paper, we had an opportunity to consider how and why naming and renaming practices were so important to certain African Americans in the 20th century, as Mahdi Blaine encouraged us to reflect on an important form of Black Muslim self-fashioning in the United States. And so reading both of these papers encouraged me to reflect on a number of varying things. So as I share, please feel free to respond according to what feels comfortable to you. And so I'd like to offer comments in response to both of these fascinating papers, but I'll keep my comments somewhat brief, if that's okay, in favor of more time for Q&A, especially since there's so much more that could be said about each of these topics. And so Mohsin Ali's paper, Muslim Historical Thought in 19th Century North India, traces a dual trajectory of historical writing and builds upon two major arguments. One, that European modes of historical writing influenced the impulse to disregard the writings of previous generations of Muslim histories and early Islamic intellectual sources. And two, he identifies a trend in which there was interest in framing an Islamic past according to an alternative genealogy of Muslim and legal thought, and which influenced a kind of resurgence of Hadith studies in 18th century North India. Ali finds that this sort of historical shift takes place through the medium of Delhi College, and further asserts that this epistemic fracture produced a separation between an apparent Muslim past with the so-called present, right, and its disseminations, as he says, remains understudied. And so he rectifies this by illuminating how Urdu translations of British historiography contributes to a new sense of intellectual modernism, right, which seems to call prior methodologies of conceiving historical events from Islamic sources into question. And so it is not merely that a more modern approach to historical writing supplanted an older, inferior one, as Ali suggests. Rather, the presence and reliance on British academic works at Delhi College reveals certain tensions regarding reveals notions of regarding notions of temporality, excuse me. So for example, sort of identifying certain modes of thought as either traditional or modern through what we might view as colonial education, perhaps. As well, this paper illuminates the impact that colonial historiography had on Indian Muslim intellectual production, ways of conceiving and articulating the past. And so, Mohsin, your discussion of this intellectual tension in colonial India carries deep resonances, in my mind at least, with the plot line in a 1962 West African novel entitled Ambiguous Adventure that was written by Sheikh Hamidou Khan. And so in this classic tale of immigration, the protagonist, Samba Diallo, is a young student at a madrasa, a Quran school in Senegal, who is suddenly sent by his parents to study philosophy in Paris. And so what was an attempt to arm their son with the tools of French colonial power results in his ideological and ontological kind of fracturing in which he must then navigate materialistic secularism espoused by the French, as well as the religious spiritual legacy of his homeland. And so the story communicates the deep and often conflicting impact of colonialism. It also tells us something about the lasting impact of epistemic violence and religious repression that seems to tear at the seams of one's internal constitution. And so just like the character of Samba Diallo, Indian Muslim intellectualism should not necessarily, I think, be thought of as a matter of this or that, but rather should be viewed as composed of multiple elements, which is what I understand that you're arguing. Sometimes competing and contradictory, but nonetheless somehow formative and co-constitutive. And as Mohsin Ali tells us, certain Indian intellectuals conceived of an Islamic past that was radically different from the present. From his perspective, if I understand correctly, the golden age of Islamic civilizations waned and entered a dark age as, quote, the dazzling European advancements in science and technology had rendered almost all Islamic intellectual disciplines useless and outdated, end quote. And thus, so we see sort of an ascribing to a view of history that involves linear progression. And on the other hand, certain ulama in India intervened to stress that negative impressions of religious scholarship reflected an acute lack of understanding regarding their methodological approaches. At the same time, their understandings of history did not rest upon notions of civilizational decline necessarily. You also trace the presence of British colonial education in India in Urdu historiography as commensurate with the rise of hadith studies among a later generation of religious scholars who, on one hand, were able to critically revisit prior religious works, and on the other hand, maintain the importance of certain investigative methodologies that could be, I guess, salvaged through an investment in the scholars themselves, who transmitted knowledge rather than merely investigating the texts they left behind. And so, moreover, their concern with careful documentation and reliable trains of transmission regarding historical events suggests a keen sense of scholarly integrity, more than what was perhaps dismissed as older Muslim scholarship that was deficient in light of more modern or Western academic standards. And so, as an aside, Mohsin, surely analyses like yours of Muslim historical thought would be of great interest, in my mind, to organizations like the International Institute of Islamic Thought, or IIIT, who are very concerned with the nature of global Islamic education. And so I look upon my time spent interfacing with those scholars as a graduate student kindly, and would encourage you to reach out to them and share your insights if you haven't already. And so one question that I do have is about how, I guess, this fits into your broader work and intellectual concerns. If you're comfortable, could you, at the end of this, sort of maybe say something about your particular interventions and stakes therein? Also, I wonder if you might reflect on what broader implications your work has in terms of Muslim intellectual history, especially given a more sort of general impression that Euro-colonial thought and Muslim intellectual production are somehow profoundly separate. Say, for example, the sort of Huntington's thesis in terms of his sort of class of civilizations. And also, could you say more about how these sort of ideas about civilizational progress, as communicated through Urdu translations of British historical works, impact the scholarly production in Indian Muslim circles? I find this fascinating, so I feel like I want to hear more. We may or may not have time for that, but I also have another question. Considering the central theme of this conference and of this panel, I was wondering if you could sort of guide us a bit more directly toward what these modes of historical writing tell us about racialization. And I ask this specifically because I gather that you're concerned here with the presence and lasting impacts of colonial thought in Indian Muslim context, but we must be careful, right, not to assume that colonialism and racial formation to be always and at all times co-present, right? Further, I'm not so sure that we can say that racial thought in India is wholly external to its own historical, political, religious environment, right? You mentioned that the Persianate and Arabo traditionalists, quote, assumed that knowledge was embodied in people and not texts, end quote. And I have to admit that I was very attracted to this line in your paper. Yesterday, I referenced Bilal Ware's book at the end of Dr. Grewal's keynote presentation, but actually his book came to my mind as I prepared to respond to what you have shared because of that line from your paper. Bilal Ware's study of Quranic education in West Africa also emphasizes this dissonance between Islamic modes of transmitting knowledge that ran counter to French colonial education, what he calls disembodied education. And so a line in his book cuts to the heart, no pun intended, of his whole argument about the body as an archive of knowledge. And it goes like this. He says, human bodies of knowledge are made, not born. Islamic learning is brought into the world through concrete practices of corporal discipline, corporeal knowledge transmission, and the deeds of embodied agents. Knowledge of Islam does not abide in texts, it lives in people, end quote. And that's on page 9, I believe, of his text. And so what your paper encourages me to think about, especially as someone who is interested in discourses about embodied knowledge and Black Atlantic Islamic context, is how these sort of differing trajectories of knowledge implicitly views the other as deficient, right? Both are concerned, I think, with the veracity of their source material. But while what we might call the sort of a Western academic approach places emphasis on persistent documentation in text, perhaps rendering scholarship somehow independent of the scholar, certain aspects of Muslim scholarly tradition, right, were founded upon, at least part of it, acute memorization of concepts and extensive narration. And so this apparent lack of attentiveness to text is unfortunately viewed as a deficiency of mental faculties and evidence of illiteracy. On the other hand, on the part of sort of Muslim scholarly tradition, and an inattentiveness to personal character, integrity, trustworthiness, as well as a tendency to neglect memorizing the foundational text of a given tradition reflects an intellectual deficiency of its own, as well as a missed opportunity to apply what knowledge is actually for, right? That is the cultivation and development of the full human being, or soul, heart, and mind. And so I wonder how these different approaches to marking knowledge shape impressions of the other, right? Particularly as your paper tells us something about a kind of a move toward professionalization and modernization, right, at locations like Delhi College that then perhaps influence a broader range of discourses about Muslim scholarship. I know I just threw a lot at you, but so let me stop there and move on to Mahdi's paper. And so Mahdi Blaine's discussion of Black religious subjectivities and specific kinds of self-fashioning as conceived through the Moor Science Temple opens with a vital misunderstanding, right? That results in the mayor of Philadelphia, or at least his representative, misrecognizing Moorish Americans who are mainly of sub-Saharan African descent as somehow actually Moroccan, right? Somehow sort of replacing or supplanting a positive mythology of Black religious selfhood that stands somewhat outside of, I guess, a temporal understanding and beyond a geographic location with a kind of geolocatable North African nationality that is legible to the historical diplomatic ties that the United States has had with Morocco. And this is quite an interesting and unfortunate instance of maybe a willful blindness, right? A kind of re-rendering of Black identities away from one that stands as a critique of American racial order that otherwise resists the language of the capitalist nation state and whose very understandings of political sovereignty are directly tied to economic and political dispossession, the full recognition of which might further incite proposals for, say, reparations. And so I wonder if there might be an opportunity to revisit your delineations between what we understand as Orientalism in this Saadian sort of understanding, as opposed to Black Orientalism. They both seem to contribute to framing Muslims as outside of the West. And so it seems that they potentially carry similar implications for the construction of Muslimness, but it seems to different ends. Moreover, many could assume, perhaps rightly so, that these framings of the Muslim other extend from quite different ideologies about the human. You conclude that Black American representations of the Moor figure were not so much informed by a utopian past, but rather were, quote, a means to articulate Black American modernity on its own terms. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about that. And as you prepare to maybe respond, I'm thinking about Spencer Drew's recent publication on Noble Drew Ali's religious politics that focuses on Moorish identity as a route to juridical access and what Sylvia Chan Malik references as a kind of counter citizenship. Also, your paper analyzes how these sort of varying Orientalisms are simultaneously present in early 20th century Black urban religious space. But of course, as you show, Orientalism has a much older genealogy in United States religious history in terms of how Muslims were represented through American popular imaginaries. Muslimism was viewed as distinct and separate from sub-Saharan Africanists, for example. Kambiz Ghani Basiri discusses this phenomena as de-Negrification, a term I don't find very graceful, but as well as sort of de-Islamicization, right, in this history of Islam in America. And so a well-known case would be that of Prince Abdurrahman Ibrahim ibn Suri, who was able to seek his emancipation after it was discovered that he could read and write in Arabic while enslaved in Mississippi, and was in fact of royal African Muslim lineage, as he originally told his captors. As his story spread through various news outlets that reached all the way to the White House, the prevailing logic was that he was a Moroccan prince that was mistakenly caught up in the slave trade. Of course, due to prior geopolitical relationships with Morocco, which you sort of draw out, certain depictions of Prince Abdulrahman lifted him higher, I guess you could say, on the white American scale of racial categorization, as these sort of widespread mythologies about African inferiority could not otherwise explain why enslaved Black Africans, Muslims, were overwhelmingly erudite and cosmopolitan. According to this racial mythology, Africans were supposed to be subhuman, and the displays of their intellectual prowess were incommensurate with pervasive representations of darker skinned peoples. And so such displays of erudition and what was viewed as exotic and fantastical were made legible to white American sensibilities regarding race. Prince Abdulrahman, seeking to navigate his way toward freedom, did not object to this characterization, and even wore Moroccan dress in the midst of his seeking funds to manumit the rest of his family. And although this approach to navigating racial imaginaries in the US context is a bit different from the kind of self-fashioning seen through the Moor Science Temple, this dissonance described at the outset of your paper, Mahdi, seems heavily analogous. And so also considering the topic of enslaved African Muslims, I wonder if we might reflect more on the genealogy of claims, the Modern Science Temple's claims about Moorishness. We might very well conclude that this sort of manner of self-fashioning is significantly shaped through and by prior Orientalist projections about Muslims, and certainly find their claims about sovereignty very much maybe a political strategy that allows for a quite specific navigation of American racial order. But I wonder if we might spend some time thinking about the question of why Islam, right? As Jacob Dorman's book on Noble Drew Ali suggests, religious identities, it's particularly in this case, are drawn from both imagination and inheritance. And so I think that this question becomes very important as we consider the reemergence of Islamic self-fashioning elsewhere in Black religious communities, say the lost foundation of Islam, right? And so I think it's a worthy pursuit to locate these eruptions of Islamic identity, perhaps in secret societies, for example, but we should consider the resonances and or rootedness that these kinds of world-making projects have with or within the historical presence of Islamic practice within Black American religious history itself. After all, I think you perhaps sense this as you describe how Noble Drew Ali believed that Islam was the original religion of Black Americans and that, quote, it lied within them, waiting to be awakened, end quote, and that their Islamic faith was, quote, imbued with unseen, fixed, morally righteous qualities, end quote. And so finally, your argument about the reading, about the deployment of Moorishness as a kind of humanist ideal seems highly resonant for good reason with Terence L. Johnson's notion of an abolition ethics to give language to the broad and piercing critiques of American democracy and racial capitalism articulated by and through Malcolm X. As such, I think you highlight something quite important about not just the meaning making involved in the formation of Black American religious identities, but you place this phenomena squarely within if I understand you correctly, a continuum of abolitionism and anti-colonial resistance in favor of what we might think of as the fitra, right, state of the human, that is perhaps deracialized, just, righteous, etc. Perhaps that might be something we can reflect on as well. And so I'll end here, but let me say again that I really enjoyed learning from what you both have shared, and I want to congratulate you on excellent and thought-provoking work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Carter, for all of your comments. I'm not sure if I'll be able to address all of it, but let me, I guess, to start with talking about, I guess, my particular interventions and sort of broader project. So this is a section from my dissertation, which is about the ways in which modern or ulama from the 19th century have, in India, have given a lot more attention to writing histories, and how for many of them, their reputation as ulama has been built on the histories that they've written. So starting with Shibli Nu'mani, who died in 1914, to Abu Hassan al-Nadawi, who died in 1999. There's a group of scholars in North India that were read in India, but also in Arabic in the broader Middle East, and they were recognized as these, like Rashid Rida called Shibli like the best or the most famous Indian scholar in Al-Manar, but they're mostly writing histories, not like traditional fiqh or hadith or tafsir. So I was really interested in this new way of gaining scholarly prestige as an alim through writing histories rather than writing traditional commentaries or works of fiqh or tafsir and fatwas, and that's and so that led me to explore the ways in which thinking about history had become really important since 19th century in the modern period, and I couldn't really explain everything I wanted to about the ways in which these scholars are writing history and imagining what history is and conducting historical analysis by simply referring to a colonial genealogy or a Western genealogy. And so that made my task harder, because then I had to go back and research 19th and 18th century histories in India and in Arabic and in Persian, which definitely added a lot more time to my research than I had anticipated when I wrote my prospectus. But it showed me the importance of looking at an intellectual genealogy beyond the West, and looking at influences beyond Europe. So Ottoman influences, as well as influences from a wider Indian Ocean network of scholarship that I felt were really, really important and influential, and were separate from colonial influences. So that's a broader project, and this is where this section comes in. Regarding, let's see, broader implications of racialization. Yeah, so I was really interested in the ways in which, for example, the works of Ibn Khaldun were being read very differently. So amongst a number of sort of the modernist intellectuals, Ibn Khaldun's work helped solidify the ideas of certain groups of people are inherently different. And so there were different notions of castes, even amongst the Muslims, sort of like well-bred Muslim families versus Muslims that had were converts. And so they didn't have lineages that went back to outside of India. And so works like Ibn Khaldun's work helps solidify this idea that people are inherently different, even amongst Muslims, but also that Muslims are inherently different from Hindus. And a similar discourse is taking place amongst certain Hindu movements of sort of a racial difference from Muslims who were deemed as foreigners. And I didn't see this similar type of usage of works like Ibn Khaldun by some of the ulama I examined, and this extends to some later scholars. So like in a review of a work by Shibli Nu'mani, a scholar who died in 1914, a lawyer, a graduate of a law school in colonial India, is reviewing his work in the early 20th century and is surprised that even though Shibli quotes Ibn Khaldun so much, he doesn't seem to understand Ibn Khaldun's biggest intervention of showing differences are natural amongst lineages, whereas Shibli seems to be only interested in using Ibn Khaldun for intellectual history. So works are being read differently as well. And some people are interested in history to solidify notions of identity, and not just of Muslim identity, but Sir Said Ahmed Khan was also very much committed to delineating a very specific North Indian Muslim identity that left out Muslims in Bengal or South India as sort of a separate community. So there were multiple notions of community and multiple notions of races, multiple notions of different kinds of Muslim, and of course, different notions of how Muslims are different from Hindus. So these were some of the ways I saw that race became much more of an issue, particularly for people who had been socialized into colonial systems of knowledge. And I did not, at least so far, I haven't really noticed the same type of attention to race in the late 19th century and even the early 20th century in the works of those who have not been socialized in colonial knowledge systems. They still have ideas about caste, but it's not being read. They're not using history to further solidify notions of caste the way more modernist intellectuals are. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, and I look forward to any other further questions. Thanks.
Yeah, so no, thank you for all the comments. There's a lot to think about. In terms of, sort of the Saidian formation of Orientalism versus, actually first, just to acknowledge Professor Grewal's comment in the chat. No, I totally agree. Definitely something that slips me and a lot of other people's minds. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the conversation, and I'll definitely be better. But I've always had an issue with Said's sort of formulation of Orientalism. I think there's a lot of value to be extracted from it, but I mean, it is this sort of elite milieu of European intellectuals, politicians, and I get it. We're talking about the production of knowledge and how that rationalizes, and legitimizes relations of power, extraction, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't really create a good picture of how these sort of, economies of meaning just mean to regular people in Europe. Said doesn't really talk about that. And that's fair. I don't think he needs to concern himself with everything tied to Orientalism. But I think I'm more in line following Susan Nance's sort of articulation, in which this formulation is sort of choosing to center the question of how individuals or communities have interpreted and reformulated representations of Muslims and the Middle East. And I think just focusing on this sort of community level and local level can get you a better picture of how these things are being articulated and the different ways in terms of how they might be reformulated in different contexts. And in terms of Black Orientalism, of course, there's Sherman Jackson's articulation. In an earlier version of this paper, I was actually focusing on, discourses in the late 19th century regarding Chinese Exclusion Act and different sort of reactions that both the white and Black press had with Chinese migrant communities, and which coalesced into the Chinese Exclusion Act, and how I was talking about this. And I wasn't really sure how I felt about this argument, but at least I thought I saw a shift in terms of Black American discourses in the late 19th century, trying to stay away from cultural difference and juxtaposing that by using Chinese Americans as this object of cultural difference that need to just sort of articulate our articulation, or I mean, what's the word? You know, our, that we're ready to be, you know, for full citizenship, whereas the Chinese migrants are not. But ultimately, this sort of thinking would, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, would actually reaffirm that, you know, questions of American citizenship still rested on racial lines. So I was thinking, you know, there was this sort of themes of cultural difference that was pretty adverse in the, like, that the Black press was pretty averse to. But then with the MSTA and other movements in the early 20th century, you see that cultural difference emerges as a means to articulate political inclusion into the US. And then, I mean, in terms of why Islam and sort of like this, thank you for that. I didn't know about the history with Abdurrahman. I thought that was actually very interesting. I mean, it's interesting, this sort of, I mean, we could tie it to, like, you know, this original treaty between the US and Morocco, but I'm sorry, I don't buy that, like, you know, average people are sort of like buying into this, but it's interesting that, you know, in the South, you have countless stories before the Great Migration of Black Americans trying to pass off as, you know, Arab, Turkish, Ottoman salesmen. Or, I mean, there was a famous story in the Chicago Defender later it was a cafe, a coffee shop that was owned by a supposed Turkish man. But then it got revealed that his accent, his Turkish accent, he slipped into a Southern accent. And that was sort of the big reveal, like, oh no, this guy's not Turkish. But I mean, it's interesting because obviously there's something to be said about the South Asian migrants that you do see in these cities that either are, you know, proselytizing either with the Ahmadiyya movement or, you know, other forms of Islam, and how they sort of figure into the story. And I'm not as deeply like intimate with those sort of histories and interactions. But I mean, I think figures like the traveling Moor, figures that one are being, you know, it's sort of a double thing where you have white American sort of views of the Moor, of Muslims, but then you have like articulations that like the MSTA sort of like taking that and like reflecting it back in a way that I don't know. I mean, sorry, I might be all over the place. I'm still thinking about this. But I don't know if you had any sort of comments or just like trying to clarify.
Yeah, well, I mean, so some of the things that I'm thinking about are, and one of the things that sort of, I think sitting behind that question, why Islam, is it doesn't appear, considering the manner in which, considering the American religious history, and how sort of religious difference gets sort of racialized in a particular kind of way, in a specific way. It doesn't seem that Islam is a convenient sort of route to citizenship, even counter citizenship, right? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what we can draw from that, but I'm also wondering that about the manner in which, right, these kind of discourses about origins, about sort of natural religion of Black Americans, right, doesn't come from nowhere, is what I think I'm suggesting, right? I mean, you know, if we talk to historians like Amir Muhammad, who runs the Islamic History Museum in Washington, D.C., I mean, he has all of this sort of these materials and sort of documentation about a continuum of Islam, Muslim presence amongst people of African descent in the United States, particularly in that extends from the sort of late 19th century into the 20th century, as opposed to thinking about this kind of almost magical rhizomic emergence of Islam that apparently comes out of nowhere. And so I'm just wondering about how, particularly in the field of Islamic studies, particularly those that are interested in thinking about Islam in America, in terms of studying that history, how we continue to draw those connections. That's all. I mean, that's all I was asking. I'm not trying to trip you up or anything like that, I promise. Yeah, so, and there was something else that you mentioned earlier that I had thoughts about, but I think I lost it. Yeah, and so, great. I think I do want to respond to Professor Gural's comment. I think she does say something important about how we are intentional about language, right? And so like her, I do agree that while it does seem like a kind of a technicality, I think there is something to be said for paying attention to what and how we describe the people that we're talking about. Oh, yes. We can't see this comment. Yeah.
I can read it out loud.
Okay.
If you'd like. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in the chat, Zarina commented, this is a comment for Mahdi, but I hope it is relevant to others. I am writing a book about Islamic English, and I'm struck by your consistent pronunciation of the Ain every time that you pronounce Noble Drew Ali's name. Would you or we overcorrect Muhammad Ali's name this way? I don't think we would, and I think as scholars, we have to think about reproducing Arab primacy. In the previous paper on North Indian Muslim thinkers, the names were not pronounced the ways Arabs might have pronounced them. This might seem like a small technical point, but for those of you who know the history of the MSTA, we know the significance of names. I think we should honor local pronunciations of those names. That was the comment.
I can just make a small comment on that. As someone who learned to read Arabic first, and even though I'm Indian, and then learned Urdu much later, I do have a habit of pronouncing Urdu words and names with an Arabic accent, and Urdu teachers have called me out on it and have made me more conscious of not doing that. So it's something that I've had to learn not to do.
Yeah, and so, oh, go ahead, Kylie. Okay.
No,
well, there was also, and there was also a chat. So I'm not sure if we should direct people's comments to the question box or what, but it seems that there's, anyway, Khadija said something, the notion of the Moor is so exotic, unclearly defined in its origin, and therefore fluid. So it seems understandable that Black American Muslims within the Moor Science Temple of America would be able to appropriate it. I'm not sure how I feel about this term appropriation. I don't know if I need to say more about that, but I don't know. I feel like I want to take some time to think about this term because people have used this term appropriation in both in a kind of passing sense, and some folks have critiqued it. So I think I'm just sort of pointing out that we should be careful with using terms like appropriation, particularly in terms of thinking about histories of African-American Muslims appropriating Islam and things like this. So not that anything was meant by that, I'm just putting that on the table.
It looks like we might not have any questions, so I wanted to ask the panelists if you have any last minute things to say before we close it off. Good to go?
Well, can I say something real quick?
Of course.
I wanted to thank both Mohsin and Mahdi for the wonderful papers and encourage them to reach out to me. so we can continue dialogue if they have questions. Or I know I threw a lot at you, so I apologize for that. But yeah, once again, bravo on these wonderful papers.
Okay, thank you. And if anybody didn't get a chance to ask their questions of the panelists, feel free to email us at the organization at igsacouncil@gmail.com, and we'll connect you to the panelists should you have anything more that you'd like to say. And thank you so much to everybody for this last great panel. Like for all of the others during the conference, we very much appreciate the interaction from the audience, Dr. Carter's comments to the presenters and the presenters themselves. We also appreciate everybody who helped make this conference kind of possible in this new space over Zoom. I want to shout out again Emma Harbour and Maxine Barnes for being crucial cogs in making it happen, and we really couldn't have done it without them. And the conference is also only possible with the continued engagement and support from the Islamic studies and Middle East studies communities. So we hope that for everybody in attendance or who will watch this video later, that you will encourage your students and colleagues to submit abstracts to our annual conference, because it's a kind of a unique space for graduate students to showcase work. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time and for your engagement, and we look forward to seeing you next year.